Imagine waking up on a frosty morning in 890, at a time when longships sliced through icy waves and sagas were not just stories but the very fabric of life. Did you ever wonder what it was truly like to be a woman in that rugged, ambitious world? What hidden pressures, what unspoken rules silently shaped every moment of her existence? Number 8. The unending chore list. Picture this. The year is 890. Add. The air in your longhouse is thick with the scent of wood smoke, simmering stew, and unwashed wool outside. The harsh Nordic wind howls a relentless tune. As a Viking woman, your day does not begin with a leisurely stretch or a moment of quiet reflection. It begins with an immediate, demanding, and often overwhelming set of duties that will stretch from dawn until long after the last ember glows in the hearth. This was not just about keeping a tidy home. It was about the very survival of your family, your clan, and indeed the entire settlement. And the sheer, unyielding volume of this labor was an expectation that silently, profoundly shaped a woman's life, often robbing her of personal time, independent pursuits, and even at times, her very breath. Think about the sheer physical effort required just to maintain a household in an era before running water, electricity, or even simple conveniences. Water was not something that flowed from a tap. It had to be fetched often from a distant well or a frozen stream, bucket by heavy bucket. This wasn't a once-a-day task. Cooking, cleaning, washing, brewing, and even simple hygiene demanded a constant supply. Imagine carrying heavy wooden buckets, perhaps multiple times a day, over uneven, often muddy or icy terrain. Your muscles aching, your hands numb with cold. This was not a chore shared equally with the men, whose primary roles revolved around farming, raiding, trade, or craft. This was a woman's domain, a ceaseless physical demand placed squarely on her shoulders, regardless of her age, her strength, or her current health. Then there was the food. Viking diets were simple but required immense preparation. Grains needed to be ground, a painstaking process often done with a corn stone, which meant hours of repetitive back-breaking work. Meat and fish, when available, needed to be preserved through smoking, salting, or drying, processes that were labor-intensive and required constant vigilance. Vegetables, often root crops, had to be harvested, cleaned, and stored. Every meal was a major undertaking, not just in terms of cooking, but in the entire cycle of food preparation, from raw material to finished dish. And it was expected that the woman of the house would oversee, if not personally execute, every step of this process, ensuring her family was fed, nourished, and ready to face the demands of their own harsh lives. Beyond sustenance, the Viking longhouse itself was a constant project. The earthen floors needed sweeping. The animal stalls inside, yes, animals often shared the warmth of the longhouse, needed mucking, and the peat fires, the heart of the home, needed constant tending. The smoke from these fires, while providing warmth, also filled the air, coating everything in a fine layer of soot and demanding regular cleaning of utensils, bedding, and clothes. There was no escaping the perpetual cycle of cleaning and maintenance, a cycle that again fell predominantly to the women. The expectation was not just to keep it clean, but to keep it functional, warm, and ready for whatever the unpredictable Viking world might throw at it. But perhaps one of the most profoundly unfair burdens, and one that often goes unacknowledged in romanticized versions of the Viking Age, was the sheer volume of textile production. Clothes did not come from shops. Every single thread, every piece of fabric, every garment worn by every member of the household, from the humblest thrall to the proudest chieftain, was the product of immense, painstaking female labor. Wool had to be shorn from sheep, cleaned, carded, and then spun into yarn. This spinning was a never-ending task, often done while sitting by the fire, walking, or even during social gatherings. The yarn then had to be woven into fabric on a standing loom, a process that demanded strength, skill, and hours upon hours of focused attention. Imagine the sheer monotony, the repetitive strain on hands and eyes, as women meticulously crafted every tunic, every cloak, every pair of breeches for their families. And once woven, the fabric had to be cut and sewn into garments, a further skill requiring precision and patience. This wasn't just about making basic clothing. It was about producing durable, warm, and often beautifully adorned textiles that represented status, wealth, and practical necessity in a cold climate. The expectation was that a woman would not just make clothes, but make good clothes, sufficient in quantity and quality for her entire household, season after season. Archaeological findings from sites like Birka and Hedeby, rich in textile fragments and weaving tools, bear silent witness to the monumental scale of this female labor. And if that wasn't enough, Viking women were also responsible for the management of the dairy and poultry, milking cows, processing milk into butter and cheese, collecting eggs, tending to chickens and geese. These were daily tasks that required knowledge, consistency, and a hands-on approach. Produce from these endeavors was not just for the family's consumption, but often for trade, contributing directly to the household's economic standing. It was another layer of unceasing responsibility, another expectation that women would not only manage the domestic sphere but also actively contribute to the economic viability of the family through their labor. Even the production of ale and mead, essential beverages for social gatherings, religious rituals, and daily consumption, fell largely within the woman's purview. Brewing was a complex process requiring careful temperature control, knowledge of herbs and fermentation, and considerable time. It was a skill passed down through generations, a vital contribution to community life and household hospitality, and yet another task that added to the endless roster of a woman's duties. So, when we speak of unfair social expectations, the unending chore list stands as a towering example. It was unfair, not just because the labor was immense, but because it was often invisible, unglamorous, and taken for granted. While men might return from raids with plunder or from the fields with harvests, the constant daily effort of maintaining the home, feeding the family, and clothing everyone was a quiet, relentless grind. There was no day off, no escape from the demands. A woman's worth was intrinsically tied to her ability to manage this colossal burden, to be efficient, resourceful, and tirelessly industrious. Her reputation, her family's comfort, and their very survival depended on her unyielding commitment to these tasks. And while nail rolls involved danger and physical exertion, the relentlessness and sheer scope of a Viking woman's domestic expectations meant her life was a constant cycle of labor, with little time for leisure, personal pursuits, or even sufficient rest. It was a life of service, a dedication to the hearth and home that was absolute, expected, and profoundly unfair in its totality. Number 7. The chains of marriage. Imagine growing up in a world where your future, your very destiny, was not primarily yours to choose, but rather a carefully calculated transaction between powerful families. This was the stark reality for many Viking women in 890 AD, where marriage, far from being a romantic union of two souls, was often a strategic alliance, a means of consolidating wealth, forging political ties, or settling disputes. The social expectation was that a woman would accept her role in this grand familial chess game, that she would be a valuable pawn or a queen, depending on her lineage, but rarely the player. The chains of marriage, though often forged in silver and political expediency, were nonetheless binding, limiting a woman's autonomy and personal choice in one of the most fundamental aspects of human life. In Viking society, particularly among the jarls and wealthy farmers, marriages were not love matches. They were meticulously negotiated agreements, often involving a bride wealth or munger, paid by the groom or his family to the bride's family. This was not a bride price in the sense of buying a woman, but rather a payment to compensate her family for the loss of her labor and to secure her future financial well-being within her new household. However, the very existence of such a transaction shows the economic and social nature of marriage. A woman was a valuable asset, not just for her potential to bear children and manage a household, but for the connections she represented. Her family's honor and wealth were intrinsically tied to the match, meaning her personal feelings were often secondary if considered at all. Think about the lack of agency this implied. A young woman might grow up hearing whispers of potential suitors, not as romantic prospects but as business deals, being discussed between her father and other prominent figures. Her input, if sought, might be a polite formality, but ultimately, the decision rested with the head of her household. To refuse a suitable match could bring shame upon her family, undermine carefully constructed alliances, and even lead to social ostracization. The expectation was that she would dutifully accept her role, understanding that her personal desires were subservient to the larger good of her family and clan. This was a heavy burden, a silent expectation that stripped away one of the most basic human rights, the right to choose one's own partner. Moreover, while sagas do occasionally hint at women having some say, or even initiating relationships, these were often within the framework of culturally acceptable norms, and often for women of higher status who had more leverage. For the vast majority, especially those from less powerful families, their choices were severely restricted. They might be married off to an older man, to a chieftain in a distant settlement, or even to someone they had never met before the marriage negotiations concluded. The journey to a new home, a new family, and a new life could be daunting, filled with uncertainty and the weight of immense expectation to assimilate and contribute. Once married, a woman's status within her new household was largely determined by her husband's social standing and her ability to fulfill her expected roles. While she gained certain legal rights upon marriage, such as control over her dowry and a share of the household property upon her husband's death, her day-to-day life was still governed by the patriarchal structure of Viking society. Her primary purpose became the management of the household and, crucially, the production of heirs. The chains of marriage were not just about the initial agreement. They were about the lifelong commitment to a partnership often chosen for her, binding her to a set of duties and expectations within a household that might not be her emotional home. Consider the implications for love and companionship. While some marriages undoubtedly grew into affectionate partnerships, the foundation was often practical rather than emotional. Imagine entering such a union, knowing that your partner might not be someone you love, but rather someone who represents a strategic advantage for your family. This pragmatic approach to marriage could lead to emotional loneliness, a lack of true intimacy, and a feeling of being trapped in a functional arrangement rather than a loving bond. The social expectation was not that you would find happiness or emotional fulfillment in your marriage, but that you would successfully manage your household, produce children, and maintain the family's honor. Love was a bonus, not a requirement. Furthermore, the legal framework, while granting women some rights regarding property, also reflected the transactional nature of marriage. A husband could divorce his wife for specific reasons, such as her inability to manage the household or her barrenness. And while a wife also had grounds for divorce, e.g., her husband's impotence, physical abuse, the social ramifications for a divorced woman were often harsher. She might lose status, find it difficult to remarry, and face judgment from her community. The very institution of marriage, while offering a woman security and social standing, also placed her in a vulnerable position, subject to the whims and decisions of her husband and his family. The societal expectation was that she would uphold her end of the bargain, maintaining the household and producing offspring, or face potentially dire consequences. Even within her new home, the woman's authority, while significant in domestic matters, remained largely subservient to her husband's. He was the head of the household, the one who represented the family in public forums and legal matters. Her voice, while heard within the longhouse, rarely extended beyond its walls in any official capacity. The chains of marriage, therefore, extended beyond the initial choice of partner, binding her to a specific social hierarchy and a life defined by the needs of her new family unit, rather than her individual aspirations. The sagas, while often romanticized, provide glimpses into the emotional complexities of these arrangements. Women like Gudrun Osvisdottir from Laxdæla saga, who married 4 times, often had her marriages dictated by fate, family feuds, and political machinations, leading to a life of personal sorrow despite her high status. While these are stories, they reflect the underlying societal truth. Marriage was a cornerstone of society, but it was also a system that, by prioritizing familial and economic strategy over individual choice, placed an unfair and often emotionally crushing burden on Viking women. They were expected to be dutiful wives, capable managers, and prolific mothers, all within a union that they often had little say in forming, thereby binding them in chains that were both visible in the wedding rituals and invisible in the expectations that governed their every step. Number 6. The heir pressure cooker. Imagine living in a world where your worth, your legacy, and even your family's future prosperity hinged almost entirely on your biological capacity to produce specific offspring. For Viking women in 890, this was not a distant worry, but a pervasive, ever-present pressure. The social expectation to bear sons, and plenty of them, was an invisible but potent force, shaping her life from the moment she entered marriage until her childbearing years were well past. This expectation was a relentless pressure cooker, often ignoring the physical toll of childbirth, the emotional anguish of barrenness, or the unpredictable nature of survival in a harsh, unforgiving environment. It was profoundly unfair because it placed the entire weight of dynastic continuity and family strength squarely on a woman's womb, often without acknowledging her individual struggles or contributions beyond procreation. In Viking society, sons were not just desired, they were essential. Sons were the inheritors of land, the warriors who defended the family's honor and territory, the traders who expanded its wealth, and the ones who carried the family name into the next generation. They were the future, the continuation of the lineage in a world where ancestral ties were paramount. Daughters were valued certainly for their ability to form alliances through marriage and for their crucial role in managing the household. But the primary driver for family continuity was the male line. This fundamental belief created an immense unspoken pressure on women to conceive and bear sons, often year after year. Consider the sheer physical burden of this expectation. Childbirth in the Viking Age was a perilous affair. There were no doctors, no hospitals, only the knowledge of experienced midwives and the resilience of the human body. Infections were common, complications often fatal, and recovery a slow, painful process. Yet, the expectation was that a woman would not just survive one childbirth, but many. To produce a healthy son often meant enduring multiple pregnancies, the loss of infants to disease or accident, and the constant strain on her body. A woman's entire reproductive life could be a cycle of pregnancy, birth, nursing, and recovery, only to begin anew. The social expectation was relentless, demanding her body to perform this vital function repeatedly, regardless of the personal cost to her health or well-being. And what of the woman who struggled to conceive? In a society that lacked a scientific understanding of fertility, the inability to bear children, particularly sons, was almost invariably attributed to the woman. Barrenness carried a profound social stigma. It was not just a personal tragedy. It was a failure to fulfill a fundamental societal duty. A barren woman might face pity, whispers, or even outright disdain. Her position within her husband's household could become precarious, as her primary reason for marriage, the production of heirs, was unfulfilled. In some cases, it could even be grounds for divorce, leading to social ostracization and a diminished future. This was a cruel and unfair burden, placing blame and shame on women for a biological reality beyond their control. The pressure cooker was immense, and the consequences of not meeting this expectation could be devastating. Even if a woman bore many children, the pressure didn't necessarily cease. If she only had daughters, the pressure would continue to produce a son. If sons were born but were weak, sickly, or died in infancy, a common occurrence in that era, the expectation would reset, demanding more pregnancies, more births, more chances to secure the lineage. The concept of enough sons was fluid and often depended on the family's ambitions and the uncertainties of life in a warrior society. A single son might be lost to a raid, a disease, or an accident, leaving the family without an heir. Therefore, the more sons a woman could produce, the more secure her status and the family's future. Constant cycle of pregnancy and childbirth also had significant implications for a woman's ability to participate in other aspects of life. While women managed the household, the physical demands of repeated pregnancies and nursing would undoubtedly limit her physical capabilities for extended periods, despite her enduring commitment to the endless chores. It meant less time for personal development, for learning new skills outside the domestic sphere, or for engaging in community life beyond her immediate familial duties. Her identity became inextricably linked to her fertility and her role as a mother of sons. Archaeological evidence, particularly from burial mounds, occasionally offers a somber reflection of this reality. While grave goods reveal much about status and wealth, the ages of buried women and children, where discernible hint at the high mortality rates associated with childbirth and early childhood, these silent markers underscore the constant risks women faced in fulfilling this societal expectation and the sorrow that must have accompanied the loss of so many young lives. Moreover, the sagas, while often focusing on the exploits of male heroes, implicitly highlight the importance of lineage and succession. Prestige of families was often tied to the strength and number of their male descendants. Narratives of feuds and alliances frequently revolve around who would inherit land and power, implicitly underscoring the immense value placed on male heirs. The women in these stories, while sometimes powerful figures in their own right, are almost always defined by their relationships to men as wives, mothers, or daughters. And their primary contribution to the family's future was through their reproductive capacity. The social expectation to bear sons was, therefore, an overwhelming burden. It meant that a woman's body was in many ways considered a vessel for the continuation of the family line. Her health, her well-being, and her personal desires often took a back seat to this singular, relentless demand. It was a pressure cooker that left little room for individual identity beyond her biological function, tying her worth to the outcome of processes often beyond her control and unfairly blaming her for nature's unpredictable path. This expectation was not just about having children. It was about having the right kind of children in sufficient numbers to secure the future of a lineage in a time when life itself was incredibly fragile and fleeting. Number 5. The silent voice in the thing. Imagine living in a society that prides itself on its assemblies, its communal gatherings, where justice is dispensed, laws are made, and disputes are settled. This is the thing, the beating heart of Viking democracy, a place where free men gather to debate, vote, and speak their minds. Now imagine being a woman in this society in 890, and standing on the periphery of this vibrant public sphere. While you might possess a formidable authority within your own longhouse, your voice in the thing, the public forum where true power resided, was largely silent, if not entirely absent. This expectation that a woman's influence remained confined to the domestic realm was profoundly unfair, despite the undeniable importance of her contributions to her household and community. Meant that while women were instrumental to the very fabric of Viking life, their capacity for public leadership and direct political participation was severely curtailed. It is true that Viking women held more rights and had greater autonomy than women in many other contemporary societies. They could own land, manage their own property, initiate divorce under certain circumstances, and had a significant say in the running of the household. Indeed, within the Longhouse, A woman was often the undisputed manager, overseeing thralls, allocating resources, and ensuring the smooth functioning of daily life. This was a position of genuine authority and responsibility, and her capability in this role was highly valued, but the boundaries of this authority were clearly defined. Her influence, powerful as it was, rarely extended beyond the threshold of her home. The thing, on the other hand, was the domain of men. It was where the male heads of households, the chieftains and the warriors gathered. They were the ones who held legal authority, who judged cases, who made decisions about raids, trade expeditions, and alliances. While women might attend the thing as observers, perhaps accompanying their husbands or seeking justice through a male kinsman, they did not have a direct voice. They could not typically speak for themselves in legal disputes, present arguments, or vote on matters of public policy. The expectation was that women would rely on their male relatives to represent their interests in this public sphere, even if those interests directly affected their lives or property. Consider the irony and the inherent unfairness. A woman might be a shrewd manager of her estate, a skilled negotiator in local trade, or a respected figure within her community, known for her wisdom and judgment. Yet, when it came to the formal processes of law and governance, her experience and insights were deemed irrelevant, or at best, were filtered through a male intermediary. Her voice, so strong and decisive within her own domestic domain, became muted, reduced to a whisper in the echoing expanse of the thing. This was not a lack of capability on her part, but a societal construct that limited her sphere of influence to the private, while reserving the public for men. The sagas, while often puting strong female characters who influenced events through manipulation, persuasion, or their domestic power, rarely depict them speaking or participating directly in the thing. Figures like Aud the Deep-Minded, who led her own settlement in Iceland, were exceptions, demonstrating extraordinary leadership. Yet, even in her case, her authority was likely derived from her unique circumstances, being a widow and settler, and was arguably more akin to a powerful matriarch within her settlement rather than a participant in the broader formal legal assemblies of men. The general rule remained. Women's public roles were limited, and their voices in formal political and legal discourse were largely absent. This societal expectation meant that women had no direct mechanism to influence the very laws and decisions that governed their lives. If new laws were passed regarding inheritance, marriage, or crime, women had no vote or direct say in their creation. They were subject to these laws, but not participants in their making. This lack of direct representation was a significant disadvantage, leaving them reliant on the goodwill and advocacy of their male relatives whose interests might not always align perfectly with their own. Furthermore, the thing was not just a legal forum. It was a social gathering, a place where reputations were forged, alliances solidified, and news exchanged. By being excluded from active participation, women were also to some extent excluded from this vital social networking. While they had their own social networks within the community, these were different from the power dynamics and information flow that occurred at the thing, which often shaped the political and economic landscape of the region. Archaeological evidence, while not directly speaking to political participation, reinforces the gendered division of labor and social roles. Tools and artifacts found in male graves often reflect their roles in agriculture, warfare, or trade, activities that frequently led to public engagement. Female graves, while sometimes rich in domestic tools and jewelry, reflect their crucial roles within the household, solidifying the perception of their primary sphere of influence being the home. The societal expectation that women would remain silent in the thing was, therefore, a subtle but pervasive form of unfairness. It acknowledged their immense importance within the household and their legal rights to property, but it simultaneously denied them a direct voice in the public forums where their lives were ultimately shaped. It meant that their intelligence, their wisdom, and their experiences, while valued in the home, were not considered appropriate for the public discourse of law and governance. The Viking woman, powerful within her longhouse, was expected to recede into the shadows when the men gathered to decide the fate of their world, a stark contrast between her undeniable contribution and her limited public authority. Her silence in the thing was a heavy expectation, confining her influence and denying her full participation in the very society she helped to build and sustain. Number 4. The loom's unseen labor. Imagine a world where the clothing on your back, the sails that propelled your ships, and even the tapestries that adorned your halls were all the product of countless hours of relentless, painstaking labor performed almost exclusively by women. In 890, odd for Viking women, this was not just a craft, it was a monumental expectation, a silent demand that they produce the very fabric of their society. The loom, a powerful symbol of female skill and industry, was also a subtle instrument of unfairness. The expectation to produce high-quality textiles, often for trade and status, represented an immense contribution that was frequently unacknowledged in its full economic and social value. Often dismissed as mere women's work, yet without it, Viking society would have crumbled. Let's delve into the sheer scale of this task. Every sable thread had to be spun. This began with the raw wool sheared from sheep, which then had to be meticulously cleaned, often by hand, to remove dirt, grease, and vegetable matter. Following this, the wool was carded or combed, a repetitive process to align the fibers and prepare them for spinning. Then came the spinning itself, an art requiring patience and dexterity, transforming loose fibers into strong, consistent yarn. This was typically done with a spindle and distaff, devices that, while simple, demanded hours of dedicated effort. A woman might spin while walking, while tending children, or while sitting by the fire, but the work was constant and never-ending, as every garment, every blanket, every sail, every rope depended on this fundamental first step. Once spun, the yarn was then dyed, often using natural pigments derived from plants, minerals, or insects. This involved extensive knowledge of local flora and fauna, careful preparation of dye baths, and the precise timing to achieve desired colors. The dyeing process itself could be messy, time-consuming, and required significant resources like water and fuel. The resulting vibrant hues evident in archaeological textile fragments speak to the skill and effort invested in this stage. Then came the weaving. The vertical warp-weighted loom, a common tool in Viking homes, was a large, cumbersome apparatus that required strength and precision to operate. Weaving was not a delicate pastime, it was physical labor, often involving standing for long hours, manipulating the warp threads, passing the weft shuttle, and beating down the threads with a heavy sword beater to create a tight, durable fabric. The larger the fabric, like for sails or large cloaks, the more effort and time it demanded. Imagine the physical strain on a woman's back, arms, and hands, day after day, producing meters upon meters of fabric for her entire household. And it wasn't just about making basic functional cloth. Viking textiles were often intricate and varied. Archaeological finds from sites like Birka and Hedeby have unearthed fragments of finely woven linen, elaborate brocades, and patterned woolens, revealing an advanced textile industry. Women were expected to produce not just cloth, but high quality, often beautiful textiles that conveyed status and wealth. A finely woven cloak or a skillfully embroidered tunic was a mark of a prosperous household, and its creation was a testament to the woman's artistry and diligence. This pressure to produce aesthetically pleasing and durable textiles added another layer of expectation to an already immense workload. The output of this labor was staggering. Every member of the household, from infant to elder, needed multiple sets of clothing. Bedding, blankets, and storage sacks were also essential. But beyond the domestic needs, textiles were a significant commodity in Viking trade. Sails for the longships, a vital tool for exploration and raiding, were made from woven wool, requiring vast quantities of strong, tightly woven fabric. The production of these sails alone would have consumed immense amounts of female labor, yet their contribution to the success of male-led expeditions was rarely acknowledged beyond a simple utilitarian purpose. The very success of Viking expansion, trade, and even warfare was in part silently underpinned by the tireless work of women at the loom. The unfairness lies in the double standard. While the male contributions of raiding, farming, or trading were often celebrated in sagas and marked by visible wealth and status, the constant, invisible, and utterly essential labor of textile production was often taken for granted. It was seen as the natural domain of women, a fundamental expectation rather than a monumental economic contribution. There were no sagas singing praises to the greatest weaver, no public celebrations for the fastest spinner. Her output was simply expected, an inherent part of her role as a woman in Viking society. Moreover, this relentless focus on textile production limited a woman's ability to engage in other activities or develop other skills. While some women might have been skilled in other crafts, or even in certain aspects of healing, the sheer time commitment to spinning and weaving meant that much of their waking hours were tied to this specific form of labor. It was a life largely dictated by the repetitive motions of the spindle and the loom, a constant hum of industry that, while vital, also confined many women to a specific physically demanding and often unrecognized role. So, while the image of the Viking warrior on his longship is iconic, remember that the very sail that propelled him and the very clothes on his back were the result of a woman's unseen labor at the loom. This was not a hobby. It was an economic pillar, a social necessity, and a testament to an expectation that was both crucial and profoundly unfair in its silent, often unappreciated burden. The loom was a symbol of her skill and her contribution, but it was also a symbol of her unseen chains, binding her to a relentless cycle of production that was essential for society's survival, yet often overlooked in its true value. Number 3. The shadow of the sword. Imagine living in a constant state of uncertainty, where the men who provide protection and prosperity for your family might depart at any moment, leaving you and your loved ones vulnerable to forces beyond your control. This was the pervasive reality for Viking women in 890 at a society defined by raiding, trade, and expansion. The expectation that women would manage the home front, maintain order, and endure the fear of male absence and potential violence, all while fulfilling their immense domestic duties, was a deeply unfair and psychologically taxing burden. The shadow of the sword wielded by their own kin or by invaders cast a long, often terrifying pall over their lives. Viking society was inherently patriarchal and militaristic. Men were the warriors, the explorers, the traders who ventured far from home. Their departures, whether for a season-long trading expedition to distant lands, a daring raid on a foreign shore, or a retaliatory skirmish with a neighboring clan, left the women behind to shoulder the full burden of daily life and protection. This wasn't just about managing the household. It was about managing the fear, the loneliness, and the very real possibility that their loved ones would never return. The expectation was that they would simply cope, maintaining the stability of the home despite the immense emotional and practical challenges. Consider the practical implications of male absence. When the men left, the physical protection of the longhouse and the community largely fell to the remaining inhabitants, primarily women, children, and the elderly. While sagas sometimes depict women defending their homes with surprising ferocity, this was often a last resort, born of desperation. Primary expectation was that women would simply endure, hoping for the safe return of their men. This meant living with an unspoken anxiety, a constant awareness of their own vulnerability in a world where violence was a common currency. Raids from rival clans, opportunistic bandits, or even rogue groups of their own people were a constant threat, and women were often the first line of defense or indeed the primary targets. The threat of being captured and enslaved was a particularly horrifying aspect of this reality. While Viking men were often the ones taking captives, Viking women themselves were not immune to this fate during retaliatory raids or internal conflicts. The prospect of losing their freedom, their family, and their identity to a foreign land or a rival group was a terrifying possibility. The expectation that women would be resilient in the face of such a terrifying potential was a heavy burden, a constant reminder of their precarious position in a violent world. Archaeological findings, such as chains or specific burial practices sometimes linked to thralls, offer grim glimpses into the lives of those who suffered this fate, underscoring the very real nature of this threat. Beyond the threat of direct violence, the shadow of the sword also implied the expectation of stoicism and self-sufficiency. When men were away, women had to make crucial decisions regarding household management, resource allocation, and even minor disputes without the immediate counsel of their husbands. They had to be resourceful, capable, and resilient, ensuring the continuity of the family unit despite the absence of its traditional head. This meant not just managing the domestic sphere, but also, in essence, becoming the temporary head of the household, taking on responsibilities that were typically shared or primarily male, without the formal authority or societal recognition that accompanied such roles. The emotional toll of this constant uncertainty and male absence cannot be overstated. Imagine the gnawing worry, the sleepless nights, and the desperate prayers for a safe return. While sagas often celebrate the bravery of warriors, they rarely dwell on the silent suffering of the women left behind. The expectation was that these women would maintain an outward composure, that they would embody the resilience necessary for the survival of the family and community. Their emotional burdens were largely unseen, unacknowledged, and certainly not mitigated by societal support structures beyond their immediate kin. This emotional labor, the constant management of anxiety and fear, was a profound and unfair expectation. Moreover, if men did not return, women often faced the devastating consequences of widowhood. While a widow might inherit her husband's property and gain some autonomy, she also faced the immediate challenges of raising children alone, managing the farm without male labor, and navigating a patriarchal society as an unattached woman. The expectation was that she would quickly reestablish stability, often through remarriage, to ensure the family's survival and continuity. This placed immense pressure on women to secure their future, even in the midst of profound grief and logistical challenges. Even in periods of relative peace, the threat of the sword, whether from within or without, never truly receded. It shaped marriage alliances, influenced settlement patterns, and defined social hierarchies. Women, though not typically wielding swords in battle, were fundamentally shaped by this constant state of potential conflict. Their lives were dictated by the movements and decisions of the male warriors and traders, meaning their security and prosperity were inextricably linked to the unpredictable fortunes of men. The shadow of the sword, therefore, was a heavy expectation for Viking women. It demanded resilience, self-sufficiency, and emotional fortitude in the face of constant threats and uncertainties. It meant living with a pervasive fear for the safety of their loved ones and their own vulnerability, all while maintaining the vital operations of the household. This burden, often unacknowledged and certainly not celebrated, was a profound unfairness, forcing women to shoulder a significant emotional and practical weight in a society where their safety and well-being were constantly at risk, due to the very nature of male endeavors. Number 2. The barren shame. Imagine living in a community where your very essence, your worth, and your social standing are inextricably linked to your biological ability to produce children. Now imagine being a woman in 890 Ode, who for reasons beyond her control cannot fulfill this fundamental expectation. This was the crushing reality for Viking women who were barren or struggled with childlessness, facing what can only be described as the barren shame. This societal expectation that a woman's primary purpose was procreation, particularly the bearing of sons, was profoundly unfair because it placed the blame and stigma of infertility squarely on the woman, often leading to social ostracization, insecurity, and immense personal sorrow, regardless of her other virtues or contributions. In Viking society, children were not just a blessing. They were an economic necessity, a source of labor, and crucially, the continuation of the family lineage. A large, thriving family was a sign of prosperity, strength, and divine favor. The absence of children, therefore, was seen as a grave misfortune, and the inability to bear them was almost universally attributed to the woman. While we now understand that infertility can affect either partner, or indeed be a complex interplay of factors, in 890 as passed, the woman bore the full weight of responsibility and blame. The social pressure was immense. A young woman entering marriage would immediately be expected to conceive. Her fertility was scrutinized, and any delay or failure to become pregnant would be a cause for concern, not just for her, but for her entire family and her husband's family. Whispers might start, and her position within the household, while initially secure, could become precarious. The expectation was not just to have children, but to prove her fertility, to demonstrate her ability to contribute to the family's future in the most fundamental way. For a woman who remained barren, the consequences were devastating. She might be pitied, certainly, but she would also be socially stigmatized. Her husband's family might view her as a failure, a source of dishonor, or a drain on resources without providing the essential return on investment of heirs. This could lead to a diminished status within the household, a lack of respect, and a profound sense of personal failure. Imagine the crushing weight of knowing you are perceived as inadequate, as failing in your most fundamental duty to society through no fault of your own. In some cases, barrenness could even be grounds for divorce. While women had some legal rights regarding divorce, a man could legally separate from his wife if she was barren. This was not a minor inconvenience. It was a life-altering event. A divorced woman, particularly one deemed barren, would face immense difficulty in remarrying. Her prospects would be severely limited, and she might be forced to return to her birth family, where her continued presence might be seen as a burden. Her future security, which was often tied to marriage and the production of a family, would be irrevocably shattered. The barren shame, therefore, was not just about emotional distress. It was about the tangible loss of social standing, economic security, and future prospects. Moreover, the sagas, while not always explicit about the legal ramifications of barrenness, certainly emphasize the importance of lineage and the desperate desire for heirs. Tales often feature characters resorting to desperate measures or seeking out supernatural intervention to ensure the continuation of their family line, highlighting the deep societal anxiety surrounding childlessness. The absence of children, especially sons, was a significant plot device, demonstrating the societal value placed on fertility and the resulting struggles of those who lacked it. The psychological toll on a barren woman must have been immense. Beyond the social stigma, there was the personal anguish of not being able to experience motherhood, of not fulfilling a deeply ingrained biological and societal imperative. She might feel isolated, resentful, or perpetually burdened by the knowledge that she could not provide her husband with heirs, or her family with the continuation of their name. Her identity as a woman, so intrinsically linked to her capacity for motherhood, would be profoundly challenged and diminished. This silent internal struggle, largely unacknowledged by a society focused on outward conformity, was an incredibly unfair burden. Furthermore, even if a woman successfully bore children, the pressure often did not cease if she struggled to produce sons, or if her sons died young. The expectation to keep bearing children until a strong surviving male heir was secured meant that barrenness could also refer to a lack of male heirs, extending the shame and pressure even to mothers who had daughters. The societal focus on male lineage intensified the pressure cooker, demanding not just children but specific genders, adding another layer of unfairness to a woman's reproductive life. Archaeological evidence, while unable to tell us about individual experiences of barrenness, does reveal the emphasis on fertility symbols in some grave goods and domestic artifacts, hinting at the societal preoccupation with successful procreation. The very presence of such symbols suggests a collective anxiety around the opposite outcome, infertility, and reinforces the idea that it was a significant societal concern that would naturally place pressure on women. In conclusion, the barren shame was a profound and deeply unfair social expectation for Viking women. It reduced a woman's worth to her reproductive capabilities, blaming her for biological realities beyond her control. It led to social ostracization, potential divorce, and immense personal suffering. This expectation, unforgiving in its demands, stands as a stark reminder of how deeply ingrained societal values, often rooted in lack of understanding, can inflict cruel and lasting pain on individuals, particularly on women who were unable to fulfill a role deemed essential for the continuation of their society. Number 1. The burden of beauty and modesty. Imagine a world where your appearance is not just a matter of personal preference, but a carefully constructed statement of your family's status, your husband's wealth, and your own moral character. For Viking women in 890, the expectation to adhere to specific standards of beauty, elaborate dress, and public modesty was a nuanced yet pervasive burden. While often expressed through stunning jewelry and rich textiles, this expectation was unfair, because it limited personal expression, imposed rigid social norms, and tied a woman's public perception and family honor inextricably to her physical presentation and comportment, rather than solely to her innate qualities or contributions. Viking women were not simple, unadorned figures. On the contrary, archaeological findings, particularly from wealthy burials at sites like Birka and Oseberg, reveal a penchant for elaborate dress and stunning adornments. Women wore layered woolen and linen garments, often adorned with brocades, tablet-woven bands, and intricate embroidery. The most striking elements were often the oval brooches worn in pairs to fasten the straps of an apron dress, from which chains and other pendants like keys, scissors, or small tools would hang. Necklaces of glass, amber, and silver beads were common, along with arm rings and finger rings. Hairstyles were often elaborate, sometimes involving braids, and women might have worn linen caps or head coverings. This elaborate attire was not merely for personal vanity. It was a potent visual language, quality of the fabric, the richness of the dyes, the intricacy of the embroidery, and the material and craftsmanship of the jewelry. All conveyed information about a woman's social status, her family's wealth, and her husband's prosperity. The expectation was that a woman would dress in a manner appropriate to her station, reflecting credit upon her household. To dress too simply might imply poverty or lack of respect for her family's standing. To dress too ostentatiously might invite envy or accusations of vanity. This was a delicate balance, a constant pressure to conform to a visible standard that was both an expression of identity and a marker of social hierarchy. The unfairness lay in the lack of genuine personal choice. While women likely had some say in the specifics of their garments and accessories, the overarching expectation was conformity to social norms. Their bodies and their adornment became public canvases for the display of family honor and wealth, rather than purely individual expression. Imagine the pressure of knowing that every brooch, every bead, every stitch was being observed and judged, not just by your immediate family, but by the wider community. Your public presentation was a constant performance, a silent statement that you were upholding your part of the social contract. Beyond beauty and elaborate dress, there was the expectation of modesty and decorum. While Viking society was relatively liberal compared to some others in terms of women's rights, there were still clear expectations regarding female behavior, especially in public. A woman was expected to carry herself with dignity, to be respectful, and to maintain a certain level of modesty, particularly when interacting with men outside her immediate family. Her comportment reflected not just on her, but on her husband and her entire family. Any perceived lapse in modesty or decorum could bring shame and gossip upon her household, damaging their reputation. This expectation of modesty could also extend to a woman's physical appearance. While beauty was valued, it was often framed within the context of marriageability and the ability to attract a suitable husband or maintain her husband's interest. There was likely an unspoken pressure to maintain a desirable appearance, perhaps through attention to hygiene, hair, and clothing, even in the harsh realities of daily life. The sagas, while sometimes depicting women with striking beauty, also occasionally hint at the social consequences of women who were perceived as too alluring or who transgressed textile norms of decorum, suggesting that beauty itself came with its own set of social obligations and potential pitfalls. Consider the practical implications of these expectations. Maintaining elaborate clothing and complex hairstyles required significant time and resources, adding to the already immense domestic workload. The textiles themselves were produced by women, as discussed earlier, adding another layer of their own labor to the very clothing they were expected to wear. The hours spent spinning, weaving, sewing, and maintaining these garments were part of the unseen burden of this expectation. It was not just about wearing the clothes. It was about producing and caring for them, ensuring they always met the societal standard. Furthermore, the emphasis on external presentation could overshadow a woman's intrinsic qualities, her intelligence, her skills, or her character. While these were certainly valued within the home, her initial impression in public and the perception of her family's status was often heavily influenced by her appearance. This created a superficial layer of judgment where a woman's worth was, to some extent, tied to her ability to embody societal standards of beauty and propriety, rather than solely her contributions or her true self. In conclusion, the burden of beauty and modesty for Viking women in 890 AD was a complex and subtly unfair expectation. It demanded that women meticulously craft and maintain an elaborate public persona through their clothing, jewelry, and comportment, not primarily for their own pleasure but as a reflection of their family's status and their own moral standing. This expectation limited their personal expression, imposed rigid social norms, and added significant practical and emotional labor to their already demanding lives. It meant that a woman's body and appearance were not entirely her own, but rather a canvas upon which society projected its values, placing an unfair emphasis on outward presentation as a measure of her worth and her family's honor.